Hi, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to give people about 1 more minute to log in, and then we're going to get started. So if you'll be patient, we'll be talking about voter engagement in just a few moments. Hello, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom, and we are going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second webinar in the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 webinar and podcast series, which we are cleverly calling Third Thursdays at 3. So we are today going to talk about planning an effective voter engagement effort. First, a few general logistics to share. We will allow time for questions at a couple of different points during today's webinar, including at the end. So feel free to enter your questions in the questions box that should appear in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We might be able to additionally unmute you if you have a question, if you hit the raise hand button and let us know that you'd like to be unmuted. We'll also provide access to both a video recording and a copy of today's slides to all participants following the webinar. So we will send out a follow-up email, and we'll also post them online at ourhomes-ourvotes.org. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties today, please feel free to shoot an email to Brooke Shipwright at bshipwright@nlic.org, and she'll monitor that inbox for anyone who's having audio or visual difficulties. All right, so today you'll be hearing from me, the gentleman in the bow tie, but more importantly, our guest presenter is Caitlin Donnelly from Nonprofit Vote. I should really quickly just mention that Nonprofit Vote has been a longtime partner of the National Low Income Housing Coalition for all of the voter engagement work we've done back when it was called voterization and so forth. You might have seen our website, you might have seen our toolkit, you might have seen our voter engagement guide or narrative plan. All of these are things that really are informed by the work and the expertise of Nonprofit Vote, and I encourage all of you to be in touch with them and to visit their website. So let's get into today's agenda. We're going to have a brief review of Our Homes, Our Votes 2020. We're going to discuss some recent presidential candidate engagement and give an update on that. And then we're going to get into our special topic, which apparently is deleted from the agenda slide. You'll see the blank space where it's supposed to be planning a voter engagement effort. So when you get the finalized slides tomorrow, guess what? We'll have added that. So for those of you watching the recording, please enjoy this part of the blooper reel. We'll do some questions and answers, and then I'll review the upcoming topics for webinars and podcasts. But the first thing I want to do, as always, is just a quick introduction of Our Homes, Our Votes 2020, because some of you who are participating and attending today aren't very familiar with this effort and what our goals are. So over the next 3 minutes, I'm just going to go through a couple of quick review slides. The first is Our Homes, Our Votes is about engaging both voters and candidates. In terms of engaging voters, we really do try to talk about registration, education, and mobilization equally and differently, right? Registration is, of course, extremely important because we know we need low-income voters and their allies to vote, but that requires early registration. We also want them to be educated voters, and on election day and in the days before election day in places with early voting, we need to get them to the polls, right? And we do this for a specific reason. We're trying to address a disparity in voter turnout that we believe leads to a disparity in policy priorities. When you look at the disparity between renter voter participation and homeowner voter participation in all elections recently, what you'll see is that homeowners participate at about a 20% higher rate than renters. Then, if you look at the difference for incomes, I'm actually going to pause really quickly because I'm being told the audio is bad, and I think we might switch away from phone audio and do computer audio and see if that works better. So I'm just going to do a quick pause and then jump right back in.
All right, everybody, I hope you can hear me. We just decided to switch from using a phone for audio to using a computer for audio because we were being told the audio was muffled. So if anybody can hear me and hear me clearly, please shoot that into the questions box. Getting back, okay, so it's much better. Really happy to hear that. And I apologize that it was muffled early on. So getting into the additional data that really sets the context for why we work so hard on this issue. So I covered a moment ago that homeowners vote at higher rates than renters, but the even larger and more alarming difference is the one that you see on this slide right here. People with higher incomes vote much, much more regularly than people with lower incomes. And so it shouldn't surprise us then that policymakers focus their solutions on higher income homeowners rather than lower income renters. But we don't just want to increase the voter turnout of low-income renters and their allies. We also want to get more elected officials paying attention to this crucial issue. And we know that voters believe in affordable housing solutions and ending homelessness. We recently commissioned a poll. We've got a lot of great infographics on our website, including the one that you're looking at here, which is that 83% of the public agrees that elected officials are not paying enough attention to the cost of housing. And 76% say they are more likely to vote for a candidate that has a detailed plan for making housing more affordable. So this has come up very prominently and very recently as we have worked to encourage moderators of presidential debates to actually ask a question of presidential candidates that relates to affordable housing and ending homelessness. So far, through 4 presidential debates, no housing-related questions have been asked. However, that doesn't mean that candidates aren't talking about housing and homelessness. If any of you watched the Tuesday debate that took place in Ohio, you might have seen that Senator Bernie Sanders and former HUD Secretary Julian Castro both went out of their way to mention the homelessness crisis in their remarks, even though they weren't asked about it. Senator Elizabeth Warren talked about the crisis of housing affordability and made sure to work that into one of her answers as well about priorities. And even after the debate, Secretary Castro mentioned that it's a shame that none of the debates are including a question about housing. So we have, for the most recent 2 debates, tried to put pressure on the moderators through a sign-on letter that you can find on our website, ourhomes-ourvotes.org. That sign-on letter currently has 853 organizations nationwide listed on it. You can click on a link and find if your organization is already there. So we have 853 organizations. We're sending that letter to moderators. We're not necessarily getting a lot of traction with the debate moderators, but we are getting a lot of traction with the actual candidates themselves. So far, 11 presidential candidates have released plans and visions and proposals for what they want to do to address housing affordability for the lowest income renters. This is a real sea change for us as it relates to presidential politics. We previously have existed in a world where candidates never even talked about the issues of rental housing affordability and homelessness, and seeing that 11 candidates have plans that are released is really encouraging. And I should say that some of these plans, many of them indeed, are quite bold, with many of them providing as a common theme $40 billion a year for the National Housing Trust Fund, some including incentives to push local communities to conduct rezoning to make it easier to build affordable homes, and many of the other proposals, including even a housing entitlement and an entitlement for everyone who is eligible for housing to begin to receive it. The most recent housing plans we saw released were last week by Senator Michael Bennet and former Representative Beto O'Rourke. You can see more information about these plans on our website, which I mentioned earlier is ourhomes-ourvotes.org. We hope you'll check it out. We have a page for each presidential candidate where we include a breakdown of their plans on housing, and then also any video clips or articles in which they specifically mention housing and homelessness. Lastly, before I turn it over to Caitlin, I do want to mention a forthcoming new resource, which is going to be our Media Toolkit. The Media Toolkit is going to include some sample posts for Facebook and Twitter, sample media advisories, sample images and graphics, and again, some sample op-eds for organizations participating in voter engagement. So those are the updates from NLIHC about what we've been doing. And then what I'd like to do now is just dive a little deeper into our feature topic for today. We are doing this webinar now 13 months out from the election, and so we have a lot of time left before election day comes. So our topic today is very appropriately planning an effective voter engagement campaign. And thankfully we have with us Caitlin from Nonprofit Vote, who has a lot of expertise and wisdom to share on this topic, and I'd like to turn it over now to Caitlin to take it away.
Hello, excellent, thank you. I am so happy to be here and talking about. I am here. Hello?
Okay, we're hearing you now.
Okay, great. Is I'm on the phone and not the computer. Is the audio okay for me?
Hey, Caitlin, your audio is coming through clear. It's good.
Okay, excellent. So I'm Caitlin Donnelly, Education Director for Nonprofit Vote, and I'm excited to speak with you all about this topic. We do a lot of webinars and trainings on planning, and we're always happy when, as Joey said, people get an early start and have a lot of time to create these plans and take their time to think through all of these steps and really try some things out. I think every organization, the more they do voter engagement work, they learn more what works really well for their clients or community and what works for their organization. So I will dive into my slides. It looks like the slide I'm seeing is like more than halfway through the slide deck that I sent over. Aha, excellent. So I will tell you a little bit about Nonprofit Vote. If you're not familiar with us, we were founded in 2005, and our mission is really to serve nonprofits and to help you all get the people you serve engaged in voting in elections. And so we do that with a lot of fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, and other education resources so that you know the ins and outs of voter engagement. We also do some original research and programming. You see the Engaging New Voters report in the center image on this slide, and that was a report we released this May that showed that the nonprofit voters, or the nonprofits that contacted voters, those individuals had a higher rate of turnout, and they were more likely to be younger, lower income, and people of color than the general electorate. So we see that nonprofits really make a difference in terms of people turning out and also who they turn out. So you can see the research on our website. It's some pretty compelling graphs and figures for anyone who isn't bought into the idea that nonprofits are exceptionally well suited to this work. we also have a lot of state-specific information, which you'll see is very important and will come up again and again. So we can move to the next slide. All right, so when you're creating a plan, one of the first things is to get buy-in from your leadership and staff. And we also want to remind you to engage the staff and volunteers as well, getting them registered, making sure they know about upcoming elections and are thinking through how they're going to vote all the way down ballot. So of course you have the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 campaign. So you have some real buy-in up at the top with National Low Income Housing Coalition. And so those resources and messaging can really be used to remind all your staff and board members, executive directors, leaders, that it's important. And also you can use it with partners too. On the next slide, there's the voting in your state graphic again. So you really want to do some research on the dates, races, rules, and restrictions in your state. So on our website, we have a clickable map. You can click on any one of these states and information will pop up. So what are the kinds of things that you're going to learn? You might be surprised. Next slide. So there are some different rules for registration drives if you are actually registering voters. It always works better to keep registration forms and turn them in on behalf of a voter if you have permission to do so than it is to let voters take those forms home because more likely than not, they won't ever make it to the election office. But some states have, I would say, about 10 to 15 states have some sort of training requirement or for anyone who wants to run a registration drive or assist voters in registering. You'll also need to find out where and how to obtain voter registration forms. And you need to know how you can assist voters and how to handle incomplete forms. So the rules about that really vary from state to state. And so I have a link below. National Voter Registration Day and Fair Election Center put together really great rules for voter registration drives for every state. And that will tell you everything from, you have 7 business days to turn in a form to if there's a training requirement and how to go about getting that training. To how to handle it if a voter does not fill out a form completely and you notice that they have missed a field. So that is really important because we think and talk a lot about staying nonpartisan when we talk about voter engagement, but there's also these registration drive rules and making sure that these forms are handled properly and that voters are being registered. And that, when they leave thinking that they registered with you, that registration really does go through. The other rules you'll want to know about are eligibility. In your state, there might be pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. There are different laws in every state about voting as an ex-felon and when and how voting rights are restored. If they're taken away. Voter ID is a pretty high-profile topic in the election world, and more states are requiring voter ID, sometimes photo ID. So you want to be aware of the ID needed so you can inform voters of what they'll need to bring to the polls. And you may also want to look into absentee and vote by mail voting for folks who may not be able to vote on election day at their polling place. Some states will send every voter a ballot, such as in Colorado. And in some states, you need to show proof that you are not going to be available on election day. So figuring out the rules around that for your state can also be really helpful for voters. All right, the next slide, please. Okay, so obviously I'm focusing a lot on voter registration because if you're not registered, you can't vote. But there's a number of different types of voter engagement strategies that you can take on and use to make the people you serve feel really empowered and excited about voting. So voter registration is one piece of that. There's also voter education. So that's really informing voters about how they go about voting and what's on the ballot. And you can separate those out too. So, for someone who's never voted before, they may feel really intimidated, not knowing what to expect at the polling place or even where their polling place will be. If they've never, if they haven't seen a ballot before and don't know how to mark it, they don't know what's going to happen when they walk through those doors. You can hold a, mock election. And, I think when I think about a mock election, I often think of, being in elementary school or middle school and, kids practicing their public speaking. But you can really focus on the election administration pieces. That people will go in, they'll generally be asked for their address so that they can locate the voter in the rolls, may ask for ID, and so you can practice those elements of the voting process with people to make them feel more comfortable. And of course, you can educate them about what's on the ballot and lead them to information that will help them decide who they want to vote for or what they want to vote for in the case of ballot measures or ballot questions. And there's a number of really good nonpartisan resources, vote411.org, Ballot Ready. You should be able to find one in that's accurate and up to date for your community. There's also candidate engagement. So having candidate appearances, if we're talking about more local elections, doing candidate forums, candidate questionnaires. So you can engage with candidates. You can also share your research with them. And there's ballot measure advocacy. So nonprofits are allowed to take a stand on ballot measures. So that is another way to engage people because you can really take a stand there. And of course, get out the vote. And so that's also really important, reminding people in the weeks before the election, whether that's the primary election, a special election, or a general election, that election's coming up and reminding them where their polling place is and the importance of voting. So you have a lot of options for how you want to engage people. Next slide, please. All right, so once you've decided, the activities you want to take on, and hopefully voter registration is one element of that, and you have the buy-in and you've done some of that research, you definitely want to reach out to your local election office. Your local election office can be a great partner in this work. Next slide. Because they have the answers to all your questions and all the voters' questions. So you'll want to reach out to them. I would start with just your local election office in whatever town or city you're located in. Give them a call or, show up and explain that, you want to start engaging voters as a 501c3 organization. You're going to remain nonpartisan. But that you really want to engage your community because you know that there's a participation gap there. So your local election office can provide you voter registration forms, but they also have some other resources. They may be able to provide training to you or your staff or volunteers sample ballots for voters to review or practice with, and they may even put out voter guides, especially if there are ballot questions. They may be putting out a voter guide to explain what those questions are and what a yes or no vote would mean. I advocate for having like a link to your local election office on your website so that your websites are sort of talking to each other. People can reach their website from yours because a lot of these election offices, their website will have tools to allow voters to look up their polling place, make sure their registration is up to date, find out when local elections are, find out how to run for office if they decide that's something they want to do. Generally, election offices should be excited to have you partnering with them, but they do have limited staff, so set some realistic expectations for how much they may be able to do for you. But it's always good to have that open line of communication so that if questions or when questions from voters come up, they're not surprised to hear from you at the election office. There are also other partners you may want to engage. Other nonprofits in your community might want to partner with you to host forums or town halls, either for candidates or on issues of electoral significance. Other partners could offer to do, voter registration at your events or have you come to do registration at theirs. And they could also be working on voter guides or questionnaires, and you want to include your questions about housing in those. So I really recommend reaching out to, groups you're already working with in your community or nonprofits that do a lot of voter or candidate engagement, and see what opportunities for partnership may exist there. Next slide. So no plan is complete without setting some goals. So how do we set goals for voter engagement? There are a few ways to go about that. Next slide. One of the big ones that people focus on if they're doing any sort of registration is, having a high number of registered voters registering with them. Now, many people may be registering for the first time. A lot more folks will be updating registration with you if you offer voter registration, but we know that only about 20 to 30% of eligible voters are not registered nationwide. And we also know you can only register people that you are actually talking to or asking. So we recommend that you estimate the traffic you're going to get and divide that by 5. So if you are asking every person over the course of the week who walks through your doors, how many people walk through your doors? Divide that by 5. It usually takes about 4 or 5 asks to get one voter registration. So be realistic with your goals when you're setting these, and know that even a small number does make a big difference. Because if those folks, missed the registration deadline and they wanted to vote, they wouldn't be able to. So you made that possible for them. You can also increase your impact by having people pledge to vote. So if you're offering voter registration, you can offer pledge to vote right alongside that. And a nice thing with pledge to vote is it makes a nice long contact list of voters for you to reach out to during the get out the vote season, those weeks right before an election, and reminding them about voting and that they made a commitment to vote. So number of people you register or pledge or these voter contacts is a really common goal. But there are other things you can think about. How many staff or volunteers will you involve? And this can demonstrate how deeply you are committing to this voter engagement effort. If you have many staff and many volunteers engaged in this effort. You can also look at it as opportunities to engage new partners and expand your reach in the community. So you could set a goal for engaging, several new nonprofits as partners doing this work. There's a few ways you can think about goals, but just remember, if you're focused on registration goals, you're going to have to talk to a lot of people to get a high number of registrations. Okay, next slide. All right, and so before you get started, you need to train your staff and any volunteers. And I think you should do this more than once. So if you are offering voter registration, obviously any staff member who's going to, or volunteer who will be involved in that effort needs some training. So that's the big face-to-face, person to voter interaction. But there are other ways that you want to engage your staff and volunteers beyond just like a voter registration table or drive. So your communication staff, they should be, putting information out about upcoming elections in any of the communications you have. Your leadership, whether it's your board or the directors of your organization, can write a memo to staff, can write a letter to the public, could put their name on an op-ed for the paper, demonstrating that you're really focused on this work and trying hard to get more people registered and engaged in voting. You'll also, if you're collecting voter contacts to get out the vote, you'll need a staff or a volunteer to do some data entry to keep track of all this data. You'll need someone who is in charge of completed registration forms and getting those over to the elections office. So there's many roles beyond the actual asking a voter to update their registration. And so many people can be engaged, and there's different levels of training that they may need depending on the role they are going to do. But on the next slide, I am going to focus on how you can train staff and volunteers to do voter registration. So my draft training agenda is really, I like to start with an opening go around and ask people about times they've missed voting in an election. Why did that happen? What happened? For me, I missed a really important presidential election when I was in college because I went to an out-of-state school and no one really was telling me, how to ask for an absentee ballot or get registered in the state that I was, going to school at. I didn't know if I could do that or if I'd lose financial aid. I just didn't really have anyone asking or looking out for me, and so I missed it. And having people reflect on that can remind everyone about how easy it is to miss an election and just how important you are to helping people actually get out to vote. So in the second part, really connect it to your mission as well. And so I think the 2020 campaign is going to have, has a lot of fodder in there for you to connect this directly to your mission. Then you want to talk about how to remain nonpartisan. And for people who are doing voter registration, the big ones there are, not endorsing or opposing any candidate or party. That includes if people ask if they should register as a Democrat or a Republican or Green Party or Libertarian Party, don't even try to explain the parties. Tell them where they can do some more research. But just staying really neutral when it comes to candidates for office and parties. And that includes no campaign materials. So just make sure that anyone doing voter registration with you is not wearing a button in support of a candidate that they support. That stuff is all totally fine in their personal time when they are not on on the clock or not representing your organization, but anytime it's the nonprofit's time or space or reputation, needs to stay really nonpartisan. You should review the voter registration form and talk through some of the common mistakes or just missing things that they may see on the form. I recommend doing some registration role play, so actually having them practice talking to voters and what they might say if someone says no, and even just how they'll introduce themselves if they're, going to be, tabling at an event where they don't necessarily know everyone, how they can make this ask. And of course, you want to cover how to handle a completed registration form. Is there a certain place that goes, a certain person who handles it? Make sure they know where those things go so that every form gets turned in and turned in ahead of the deadline. Next slide. Okay, so when you're doing voter registration, especially at an event or even in your lobby, you really want it to be active tabling. And so this is something to cover with your staff or volunteers during that training as well. Get out from behind the table and invite people to talk to you. You want to ask every person. Remember, if we have a goal of 100 new voter registrations, that means we're going to need to talk to 500 people. So talk to everyone you see. Always ask. If you put the clipboard and pen in their hand while you're talking to them, they'll often just start filling it out. Connect voting to their lives and the issues they care about. And try to make it a conversation rather than talking at people. Nonprofits have the goodwill and trust of the communities they serve, and so really leverage those relationships and have it be a dialogue. Next slide. All right, so it's not always, we're not always at events or doing something in a lobby. So where else can you do voter engagement? So voter registration or pledging works really well if during intake or in the waiting room when people are receiving services. But you can also have it involved during classes, meetings, or other gatherings. So you want to make sure registration deadlines, election dates, and where to find more information about upcoming elections are posted in any meeting space or anywhere your clients or community will congregate. And try to have ongoing conversations about upcoming elections. Even if they're just a few minutes long, having it be a regular part of, people's time with you will go a long way in normalizing participation in elections. I mentioned communications staff earlier. Make sure they are including messages about voting on your website, in your newsletter, on social media. A lot of states do not offer same day or election day registration, and so there's a registration deadline. Ours in Massachusetts was yesterday. You can find out the date for your state and make sure that you're making that nice and bold and that everyone knows that they got to check their registration and make sure it's up to date. Of course, special or community events are really good places to do voter registration. And whenever someone moves, they need to update their registration. So if somebody has moved into some new housing, make sure that they are updating their registration, whether they can do that online or if they need to fill out a paper form with you. Just getting that registration up to date because a primary or special election or some election might be closer than they think. All right, I think I might have, yes, one more slide. Okay, so the biggest thing around voter registration, or the two biggest things that I want to leave you with, and again, this should be part of the training, are how you can make the ask about voter registration and how to fill out forms correctly. So we don't recommend that you just ask people, are you registered to vote? A lot of people don't realize that they need to update their registration anytime they move, or if they've changed their name, or even if they haven't voted in several elections. Their voter status may have been moved to inactive, or they may have actually been purged from the voter rolls. So some creative and more effective ways to ask this question are, did you know you have to update your voter registration every time you move? Let's check your registration to make sure it's up to date, and go through that process of checking their registration with them. You can appeal to their sense of community, let them know that the community needs more voters, and just ask them if they can help out by updating their registration. I like that one because you're framing it as, instead of you're helping them with registration, they are helping you and helping the community be more engaged. The last one is really stressing urgency and ease of voter registration. So letting them know, the deadline for voter registration is approaching. Do you have 2 minutes to make sure you're registered? So emphasizing that it's really easy for them to do with you. So the most common mistakes that we see on voter registration forms are folks forgetting to check the citizenship and age boxes at the top. So those are generally right at the top of the form, just saying, yes, I'm a citizen, yes, I'm over 18. Some people will put a P.O. box instead of a home address, which I imagine could be, pretty significant for the population that you all are working with. They can put the P.O. box as their mailing address and get mail there, but it needs to be a physical residential address so that the elections office knows what district or ward or precinct that voter is a part of. Double check and make sure they put their date of birth on the line for date of birth, and that day's date on the line for today's date, and they didn't switch those because people do that from time to time. They'll put the dates in the wrong boxes. So double check those. And lastly, a lot of people forget to just sign and date the form. It's one of those the federal form and most state forms are set up in such a way so that the signature and date is lower down on the form and not really as connected to all the, putting in your address and your name and your DOB and your license number. So double check that before they walk away. So these are all things that you really want to go over with any staff or volunteers that are engaging in this work. And for every person who is doing the asking, and for every person who gets asked, the last thing I'll really encourage you to do is for them to reach out to someone else and ask them if they have, checked their registration status, if they're up to date, if they've checked out the upcoming election and who's running for office and done some research, if they've made a plan to go and vote on election day, because we know that nonprofits are more effective than campaigns in leveraging our relationships, and we know all the individuals who work for our organizations and are connected to our organizations have relationships beyond us, and that we can have an even bigger impact if we ask people to pass it on. So I believe that takes me to the end of my slides. Yes, thank you. And I am happy to answer any questions, to answer them here. You can also email me at caitlin@nonprofitvote.org.
All right, thank you so much, Caitlin, for all of that excellent information. Oh. Sorry, it looks like we're getting a bit of an echo. Okay, I think we should be good now. So sorry for that echo. Thank you, Caitlin, for all of that great information. We're going to do our questions and answers in just a minute, but I'd like to add an additional consideration to planning voter engagement efforts in your community, neighborhood, building, and how your nonprofit organization might unfurl those efforts. So everything that Caitlin mentioned is wonderful in terms of finding staff and board members and volunteers to take on roles, setting goals for how many voters we might register or turn out on election day, and how to really make a plan. But a lot of that requires money, right? A lot of that requires staff capacity. A lot of that requires copying and printing and materials and tables and supplies and so forth. How do you get a budget to execute your voter engagement plan? There are a few things to be aware of. First, prepare for funders what you think you would like to do, and then approach some of the traditional funders that you've used in your community and do some grant requests. I think you'll find, especially right now, there's a lot of support in the community of funders for civic engagement activities. If you can describe effectively what you would do with a significant grant or donation, you're going to be much more well positioned to actually receive such. Consider that money might come late in the process. Very often with elections, there are a lot of donors or a lot of funders who decide as the election gets nearer and nearer that, oh shoot, we really should be mobilizing on this. And then they have a lot of money and they're trying to find people to take it. If you have a good plan put together, and it might even be an ambitious plan, it might be a plan of something that you want to do but currently don't have the capacity to do. If you have that plan ready, you'll be in a better position when funders start looking for proposals of what they can do with their money. And having worked on campaigns in the 501c3 capacity, but also having worked on campaigns for candidates themselves, I can tell you that the closer election day gets, the more open people are with giving up money for some of these efforts. Consider some non-traditional partners. There are a lot of people in your community who maybe have never supported your work because they're not very interested in homelessness or affordable housing, but they do care quite a lot about elections. They do care quite a lot about making sure that low-income people are voting, right? Now, these individuals or these funders might have a particular political agenda that they're trying to serve, but that doesn't have to be part of what they're funding you to do. If those interests overlap with your interests, which are registering and mobilizing low-income people, then that's a happy coincidence. And I think you should consider who some of those donors and foundations are who support civic engagement work and who support grassroots power building through elections. And then also rely on your partners who are participating in your coalition. Ask that everyone contributes to the budget and be considerate of things that organizations can contribute that are in kind outside of money. There are some organizations in your coalition that might say they don't have any money in the budget to provide to voter engagement, but maybe they have a really excellent conference room that could be used for events, or maybe they have a really great button maker that you can use to make your campaign buttons and so forth. There are a lot of organizations that have something that they can bring to the table. So think about that as you're going about sort of gathering the resources for your campaign. Before we get to questions, I just want to hit on two things that Caitlin was addressing as particularly important. One of the things that Caitlin brought up considerably is that it's important for any organization doing election engagement to partner with their local election office. For those of you who have never worked with a local election office, it might sound like a confusing term, but you should know that it's really just, for most of you, your county clerk's office, your city clerk's office, or your local board of elections. In some states or communities, they might name those things differently, but it'll usually be the county clerk or the board of elections. Caitlin also walked through some really important training playing techniques, things like role playing. And I just want to emphasize that those techniques are important, not just for voter registration, but any of the other activities you might do. If you're training people on, picking people up and giving them a ride to the polls, or training people on how to effectively ask a question at a town hall meeting, doing those role plays and doing the steps that Caitlin was including when talking about voter registration are always going to be really smart things to include. And with that, I've shared everything I have to share, and I'd love to hear if any of our attendees have questions. So, Tori Beret, have anybody asked questions in the questions box at this point?
Yeah, so I have one question. Is the voting in your state resource currently showing information about 2019 elections or 2020 elections? And are all of the 2020 registration dates and primary dates currently set?
Caitlin, I think that's a question for you. Are you able to hear all that?
Yes. So the question was about the voting in your state tool and what's on that. We look to our partners at League of Women Voters with their vote411.org site and Ballot Ready and several other great groups in this sort of space to talk about the specific upcoming elections. The voting in your state tool is geared towards contacting your local election office or state election office, finding links where relevant or where they exist for online voter registration, information about voter registration, eligibility. So it is not it's information that we're frequently updating, but it's a little more evergreen than being focused on 2019 or 2020 elections. And then in terms of dates being set, they are not set in every state as far as I know. Even the presidential primaries I think we have projections on the dates we believe that they will be held. But I think there are still a handful of states that have not finalized those. Though I would imagine that shortly after the 2019 general election on that a lot of local municipalities are having on November 5th. Shortly after that, I would expect to see fairly firmed up dates for all elections in most states.
Great, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Another question. So are there ways people can check their voter registration online when we're doing client intake?
So states vary. A lot of states do have online voter registration checkers, even the ones that may not offer online registration. Many of even those states will allow you to check your status online. One tool I really like is the Voting Information Project tool, and so that's something embeddable in your website, or you could have maybe you just have the link up for their browser tool up when you're doing intake, and that's a good tool for checking status as well as getting polling place location.
Awesome, thank you so much. And then another question is, how do we work through concerns from staff or board members we want to put into a key role, but they're not supportive of our election work?
Oh, that is a great question. I may have rose-tinted glasses on, thinking like, well, why would anyone not be supportive of election work? And I guess you'd have to get into why they're not supportive. If they feel that it is partisan, I think that that's a conversation that you can have about, you know, your commitment to tax-exempt status and retaining that and maintaining nonpartisanship. And really the value of remaining nonpartisan is that you know, you're a trusted entity. You're not in it for one electoral cycle. You're not in it to sway one election or another. You know, it's really about building power for the people you serve, and having them be good, you know, advocates for themselves and their families and their communities. If it's someone who just doesn't really believe in voting, and I know there are some of those folks out there, you know, there's a variety of responses to that, and I think it really depends on, you know, what their objections specifically are. But you know, you're not hurting anyone that you serve by making sure that they are able to participate in, you know, the government that serves and, you know, dictates so many aspects of their life. That our democracy works better when more people participate and when all eligible voters are able to have a say in what happens, and when, you know, elected officials see that communities are registered and engaged and could be part of their voting block if they put the time and effort in. So those are a couple ideas, you know, not knowing really why this person might be objecting. But hopefully that helps.
This is Joey at NLIHC. I'll just jump in on that question and say everything that Caitlin said is correct. You know, and when your organization has decided to move forward with a particular project, you really want everybody on board, but there are some things, and especially sometimes some things related to contentious elections, that some people won't want to participate in. Obviously, try to contextualize the work and get people to believe in it. But if you can't get them to believe in it, my advice would be, don't put people into a role that they don't want to perform in, right? Because the truth is they just won't do it very well, right? I had an example of this in 2016. I was at a nonprofit organization doing nonpartisan 501c3 voter registration and turnout. And one of the staff members at this organization didn't believe in voting just as a method of making change, and would not encourage people to vote. And so what we did in that situation is we just gave him a bunch of other projects that were unrelated to the voter engagement project for him to manage. And then other people moved portions of their time into the voter engagement campaign. And something similar can be done with board members and their various responsibilities. You know, if there are board members who don't want to participate in a particular voter engagement effort, give them other things to do that might free up other board members who are excited about the campaign. So definitely build as much buy-in as possible, build as much excitement as possible, and then after that, I would say just don't put people in roles that they don't want. So Tori, do we have any other questions?
No, that's it.
Okay, so seeing no other questions, I'm just going to do a couple of quick announcements and then we will let you all go. This was the second Third Thursdays at 3 webinar. There are only 13 more to go. So next month, we'll get into some of the helpful tools and partners for a voter engagement campaign. And thankfully, Caitlin already shared about many of those. And then we're going to start getting into some of the nuts and bolts, right? Voter registration part 1 and part 2. We'll start getting into the role of housing providers, getting candidates on the record, educating voters. And it's just going to be a monthly thing every third Thursday at 3. So I want to emphasize that last month's webinar, which was legal considerations for nonprofits, is available as a recording at ourhomes-ourvotes.org/webinars. And so I want to finally say NLIHC is a membership organization, so please support the work of NLIHC and our efforts on Our Homes, Our Votes, and please consider becoming a member today. Finally, a big thank you again to Caitlin for joining us, and we will see you all next month on the third Thursday. All right, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.